Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Well, the Synod is ready to start in about a month's time, and Pope Francis, in a recent interview, which was reported by America Magazine, which is a Jesuit publication, he said a lot of things without saying anything at all, which is pretty common in a Pope Francis interview. And he explained that the Synod will be done basically in private because he wants to avoid ideology and gossip. So we're going to take a quick look at that here. Here's the interview article from America Magazine. And I apologize if there's any noise in the background. We're having our driveway done today, and there's a bunch of machines going. In any case, I also can't do anything about the ads. I don't know why these ads are showing up on this. Maybe it has to do with the type of person who supports the Jesuits and America Magazine today. No comment there. In any case, so Pope Francis held an hour-long press conference on the flight from Mongolia to Rome on September 4th, answering questions related to his visit in Mongolia, China-Vatican relations, and the yet unfulfilled mission of Cardinal Matteo Zuppi to Beijing. He also talked about that there will be re-released or updated a new version of Laudato Si, which I'm sure will be quite interesting. And it was asked about visiting Vietnam. He was asked about Vatican-China relations. That's not something I really want to focus on here. And I want to get to the meat of where he's talking about this whole idea of dialogue and all these sorts of things. And hold on. Here it is, down here. Okay. Francis is going to be 87 pretty soon, which is interesting. He said the Synod and it says the Synod and ideological polarization. So he was asked how ideological polarization may be dealt with at the Synod. Now you'll notice, what is ideological polarization? How is it defined? Nobody knows. Given that its proceedings will be secret, Pope Francis replied, "There is no place in the Synod for ideologies. It is another dynamic. The Synod is dialogue by the baptized, by the members of the Church in dialogue with the world and the problems that humanity faces today." Well, the question needs to be asked, ladies and gentlemen, how on earth could the Church be in dialogue with the world? Not that that's a good thing in the sense that it's used, but if the Church is in dialogue with the world, how could that be if everything that they're talking about is kept in private? This is a synod of bishops, we've been told, so are they going to have representatives of the world be there to talk with the bishops? If so, was the world asked who should represent them? You see the major issues here. This is just a bunch of gobbledygook, which is common. And it continues. But when one thinks in an ideological framework, the Synod ends. There was no place in the Synod for ideology, except, I might add, for the ideology of Synodality. That's another story. He said there is a place for dialogue and for confrontation between sisters and brothers, and confrontation with each other on priorities. This means absolutely nothing. You may as well say the grass in front of your house could be green depending on the weather. He emphasized that synodality is not something introduced by me. It came from Paul VI. When the Second Vatican Council ended, he noted that the Church in the West had lost a synodal dimension. The Eastern churches have it. This is what these modernists do. They use the Eastern churches to justify anything. This is why when you look into critiques of the new Mass, the defenders of the new Mass will often point to the East and say, look, certain things are present in the East. But this is further evidence of the Hegelian, dialectic, modernistic philosophy, theology that has imbibed members of the Church. The East and West are different. We're part of the same Church, and there's no question about that. But Eastern spirituality, Eastern ecclesiology, Eastern theological language is extremely different than in the West. There's a lot of similarities. Obviously, we're both Catholic, and there's more similarities when you look sort of to the fathers. But when you start to see the flowering of the Eastern and Western traditions over the last couple thousand years, you see this bifurcation between both sides, and they become very different. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that at all. These are apostolic churches with sort of different ways of operating. And there's always been this general customary tolerance by both East and West with each other that things are done differently. Obviously, the West represents the vast majority of Catholics. 90-something% of Catholics are Roman and Latin, I should say, in some capacity. And the East has these sizable yet minority groups all the way from India through to Byzantium, Greek, and Slavic, and all these sorts of places. And that's great. That's wonderful, and these should be celebrated. But there's a reason, for example, why the East is governed by its own code of canon law, which is different than the code of canon law used in the West. Because the church has always imbibed this Romanitas, this Roman spirit of understanding how law should be applied. It's not done well anymore, but there's a reason why these different communions within the church would have their different codes of canon law or different canonical norms. Because if you look back to the way that Rome operated as an empire, the empire itself is very different than a monarchy, which is why the term emperor is more important than the term king in the sense of governing all of Rome, because the emperor is in many ways more of a general manager, if that makes sense. He respects the sovereignty of the different places within the empire, and they're all under the same banner in a unified sense, but these places are their own empires within the empire. They're their own kingdoms within the larger kingdom, and the emperor respects this. So in the ancient Roman Empire, you would find that individuals from different parts that had different customs, they would actually be judged based on the legal customs that were common to them. So if they happened to be in a certain part of the Roman Empire and they did something that was seen as wrong in that area, they would say, well, where are you from? What are your customs, etc. Now, these were not based on things like the moral law. It wasn't like murder was okay, murder wasn't there, but it had to do with things like commerce or marriage, customs and things like that, because these things were customary to their various places. The church has always understood that the different customs within the church have to be respected by the force of law. So when you start hearing these modernists talk about, well, they do this in the East, so this is fine to do in the West, this is a complete perversion of how the church has always understood the legitimate diversity between the East and the West. We can use a term, for example, we might think of something like a symphony. Okay, so in the church, there's always been this symphonic diversity. You think of a symphony, you have all these different instruments playing. They're completely different instruments. They have different ways of operating, different shapes, different sounds. Okay, you have all of these instruments doing something completely different than other instruments, but when they're put together, you have this wonderful symphonic music. You can't have violins starting to act like wind instruments. You can't have percussion instruments starting to act like string instruments. They have to do what they're supposed to do, and if they don't do that properly, then it becomes a mess. So when you see this, well, this thing happens in the East, that's fine. If it happens in the East, it's organic, and it's been there, and for some reason it was lost in the West, and that's the guidance of the Holy Ghost over 19 centuries before the Council. So to bring it back is just simply artificial, and the modernists do this to justify everything that we do in the West. Whoops. Let's bring it back here. I'm just going to bring it up here again. So he goes on, for this reason, Paul VI created the Secretariat of the Synod of Bishops that over the past 60 years has carried forward reflection in the church on various issues in a synodal way. This, I might add, is something that was warned against by Archbishop Lefebvre. He talked about collegiality, which is basically synodality, where it's this idea that essentially the church is going to be constantly in this process of self-discovery and sort of a democratic process where nothing is certain and everything is subject to change. And that's essentially what the synods bring to us. Francis recalled that on the 50th anniversary of Paul VI's decision, I published a document and I concluded that it was very appropriate to hold a synod on synodality. This is becoming like parody at this point. It is not a fashion, rather it is something ancient because the Eastern Church has preserved it. Again, the Eastern Church has preserved things that the Western Church doesn't do, and vice versa, Pope Francis confirmed that the Synod's proceedings will not be public. We must protect the privacy, he said. This is not a television program where we speak of everything. It is a religious moment. It is a moment of religious exchange. Okay. He said the Synod members will each speak for 3 or 4 minutes, which is no time at all, and then there will be a period of silence with prayer, a moment of prayer. Okay. Without this sense of prayer, there is no synodality, he said. It is political. It is parliamentarianism, but the synod is not a parliament. No, with respect, Your Holiness, the synod is exactly a parliament. Just like in parliament, you're going to have people 2 or 3, 4 minutes to talk, and then somebody else talks, and then on the end, you're going to vote on the decision. Now, I understand that historically within the church, there is synods. We call councils synods, of course. But the emphasis is on the wrong syllable with these synods. This idea that you're going to have this continual synodality gives the impression, and it manifests, at least in practice, as if there is this continually changing nature of Catholic doctrine that is in flux by essentially majority vote. It is a parliament, what is happening here with the synods. It is not the way that the church, if you look at the Eastern churches and the way they've had synods in the past, they're not done like this at all. Anyway, that's a whole other conversation, but they're not done like this at all. They come together to come to consensus on basically what is teaching and what has always been believed by all. They don't come together to say, what is the world telling us and how do we have to move forward? This is completely anathema to the way Christianity has been understood forever. He said there will be a commission presided over by Paolo Ruffini, prefect for the Dicastery for Communication, that will issue press releases on how the synod is going. I'm sure they'll be totally unbiased and accurate. We must protect the religiosity and the identity of the person who speaks. Okay. This, I'm not making a comment here one way or the other about dogma. I'm just saying this seems to me kind of against the sort of Christian spirit. The acts, the proceedings of councils and synods and things like that in the past, you know, there's the idea that you have to hide them. That seems very strange to me. That seems very un-Christian. You know, everything will come to the light, we believe as Christians. We don't do things in secret. The secretive way is kind of Gnostic. It's kind of Masonic. You know, the Masons meet in secret, never telling them what's going on. They release a little report and let you know what they think, what they think you should know. This does not seem Christian at all, if I'm just being honest. And then he talked about there's opposition to the synod. A journalist told Francis, this synod is not only arousing much curiosity and much interest, it is also arousing much opposition and criticism. He mentioned a book circulated by Cardinal Burke talking about the synod being a Pandora's box. The journalist asked the Pope if the Pope believed this evident polarization threatened the work of the synod. Pope Francis responded by recalling that some months ago he called a Carmelite prioress who told him, Holiness, we are afraid of the synod that it will change doctrine. Now let's just pause right there for half a second. Just the fact that people are scared that it's going to change doctrine shows you're probably on the wrong track. Because, no one said when the Council of Trent was starting, I'm really worried the Council of Trent's going to change doctrine. It was the opposite. It was the intention. The Pope said to her, if you continue with these ideas, you will find ideology. Okay. You mean like climate change in Laudato Si? Anyway. Always, when in the church one detaches from the journey of communion, then ideology emerges. This sentence means nothing. But it's not the true Catholic doctrine, which is in the creed, okay? The true Catholic doctrine scandalizes, just as the idea that God became man scandalizes, that the Madonna preserved her virginity scandalizes. The true Catholic doctrine scandalizes, but the distilled ideology does not scandalize. Okay. I don't even know what that... So let's just... Okay. He's right. The cross is scandalous. St. Paul talks about preaching the cross of Christ. I mean, this is very scandalous to the average person. I get that. But it's funny. All of the defenders of Pope Francis say that traditionalists like myself are scandalous. In fact, some of them basically try to make a living grifting off of people like me and Taylor Marshall, saying that we scandalize with our views. Well, apparently Pope Francis thinks that true Catholic doctrine scandalizes. So I guess by the Pope's logic, if you're somebody out there just talking about humdrum Catholicism, humdrum apologetics, let's say, and you're just sort of saying the same old thing, and you're not scandalizing anybody, then maybe it's not true Catholic doctrine, where maybe it's the traditionalists like myself who are scandalizing with our ideas. We must be having true Catholic doctrine in our words. Obviously, I'm making fun of this whole thing, but this is just absurd. So, I guess, prepare yourself to be scandalized, because if you're scandalized by the synod, then true Catholic doctrine scandalizes. So if they come out and they say, you're going to have to confess your eco-sins or something, I'm just making things up here. I'm not actually saying that's on the table. I just trying to think of something quickly. Or, something about homosexual unions being blessed or whatever. If this scandalizes you, then this is the true Catholic doctrine, because the true Catholic doctrine scandalizes. As always, Let me know what you think in the comments, ladies and gentlemen. This has been the Kennedy Report. Until next time, God bless.